carrying on with our present situation of trying to explain a few things before I actually talk about the fall of Pan Am, we need to go over the Towers Financial Corporation. Now, to be perfectly honest, this particular element is actually kind of just a footnote in terms of the overall fall of Pan Am, but as soon as I looked into it, I realized that I couldn't bring this up without going into detail, just because of a specific person involved. But Towers Financial Corporation was an entirely separate entity from Pan Am. They really had nothing to do with each other, beyond the fact that at one point they did attempt to take over the airline in a corporate raid, but it was unsuccessful. That's where their relationship with Pan Am pretty much ends, but I felt the need to go into more detail about their story because Towers is a pretty interesting one, and frankly, the whole corporation wound up being just a complete and total massive scam. But they didn't start out that way. Most corporations start out with honest intentions. They were founded in the early 1970s in downtown Manhattan, though they were incorporated in Delaware. In terms of what they did, well, they were a debt collection agency. Yeah, you know, those people, the ones you really love getting phone calls from, yeah, that's what they did. But in their case, how they handled it is that they would actually purchase the debt from other companies. Now, for some of you, that may sound really, really weird. But the way this particular business model works is that other companies will occasionally buy a debt from a different company and receive the rights to collect it on their own. This can be advantageous for two reasons, particularly when the debt is relatively small, like only a few $1,000s. This is because a massive company, like say Citibank for example, if you took out a loan from them, but it was only like $3,000 and you never paid it back, Citibank is so large that expending the resources to collect $3,000 is pennies as far as they're concerned. It really is kind of a waste of time. These smaller entities will buy the debt off of Citibank, generally at a discounted rate, to take it off their hands, and then the smaller entity will take over the responsibility of collecting the debt, and that's how they will make their money. In Towers' case, they paid a penny on the dollar for the loan from wherever they got it from. Generally at that rate, the seller would think of these loans as pretty much worthless as far as they were concerned, hence why they were willing to sell at such a discount. And it can be a lucrative business model in many cases. Towers focused on debts that people owed to things like hospitals, banks, and phone companies, which are usually relatively small in the grand scheme of things. These weren't massive corporate loans, these were things people owed for small credit cards or phone bills. The company had been founded by a man named Stephen Hoffenberg, and he was also the CEO, president, as well as the chairman. The company carried forward pretty much as honestly as you'd expect from a debt collection agency. They would buy the debts, call the people, try to get them to pay, and in a lot of cases they would eventually. They'd arrange for certain payment plans. The nice thing about the arrangement is that because Towers was spending so little money to buy the debt in the first place, that they were more inclined to work with people who couldn't afford to pay the lump sum all at once. If someone was like, look, I can only do like $5 a month, they would be able to be like, sure, that works for us. And in the long term, they would make the money back and everyone would be happy. The debtor would no longer have to worry about owing that debt. Towers would make their money. The original company didn't have to deal with the headache. It was a perfectly reasonable venture, and then in 1987, Hoffenberg hired a man named Jeffrey Epstein. Oh no. Yeah, see, this is why I realized I had to talk about this, because I had no knowledge that Epstein was involved in this company before, well, researching Pan Am, frankly. But he became seriously involved in the company quite a bit. He did a lot. Technically, he was only a consultant, but according to Hoffenberg, Epstein made a lot of changes and was responsible for eventually leading the company down the road to becoming a scam. Not surprising, given Epstein's reputation as being just the worst. Though, in terms of what he's actually known for, as I'm sure doubtlessly most of you already know, that doesn't seem to relate too much to Towers. But in terms of how this relates to this story, Hoffenberg would set Epstein up in offices in the Villard houses in Manhattan. He would wind up paying him $25,000 per month for his consulting work. What was he consulting? I always love it when I hear consulting. I want to be a consultant. What do consultants do? They're there to consult for advice. $25,000 a month to give people advice. Listen, I just had a friend come to me the other day for advice. I want my 25 grand now. I'm just saying. Indeed, as part of Epstein's advice giving, they did try to take over Pan Am in a corporate raid. But that just didn't happen. That was partially due to Pan Am's dire financial situation after Flight 103. It wasn't worth it to them or their investors to even touch Pan Am at that point. They also attempted a takeover of Emory Air Freight Corporation, but that was also a failure. Now, just a year after Epstein was hired, he began to suggest a certain scheme to Hoffenberg, and this would eventually cascade into something downright criminal. Between 1988 and 1993, Towers Financial wasn't just making money through the debt collection business. They also raised $400 million by selling bonds and promissory notes to investors. But they were convincing investors to do this by using false financial statements. They were showing them how much money they were making, but not actually. It was a lie. They weren't as rich as they seemed, and the investors, none the wiser, would wind up paying them a significant amount of money for these bonds and promissory notes that, in truth, Towers had no real way of honoring. Hoffenberg, as well as his other associates, would then use the money earned from those bonds, or should I say stolen, to pay for things like operating costs, repay earlier investors, and to pay themselves. Hoffenberg would get greedy and start utilizing the scheme to pay for a very lavish lifestyle that even included a Locust Valley, Long Island mansion, homes on Sutton Place in Manhattan, as well as in Florida, plus, of course, a number of different cars and private airplanes. If this all sounds a little bit like a Ponzi scheme to some of you who may be familiar with that, that's because it is. It is exactly that. But maybe others don't actually know what a Ponzi scheme is, though it is one of the most famous forms of fraud, and it's named after the Italian businessman Charles Ponzi, who probably deserves his own video. But the way a Ponzi scheme works is actually quite simple. It misleads investors by falsely suggesting that profits are derived from legitimate business activities, or by exaggerating the extent and profitability of the legitimate business activities. As a result of this, it leverages new investments to fabricate or supplement the profits from the legitimate business. The investments obtained from new investors are generally used to pay old investors who are expecting their money at some point. The scheme works as long as new money is found, new investors are brought in, but that's also its Achilles heel. You always need new money. You always need new investors to pay off the old ones. If suddenly you run into a wall where there's no more investors interested, then the ones left holding the bag will be wondering where the heck their money went, and you can't actually afford to pay them. Like with most Ponzi schemes, it did catch up to them. That sort of thing just isn't sustainable in reality. You'd have to get pretty lucky for that to happen, and they weren't. In February of 1993, the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, charged that Towers Financial Corporation, while reporting a profit of $13 million for the 4 years prior to June 30th, 1991, had actually done the opposite of that. More than the opposite of that. They lost $137 million. And the only reason they were still afloat is because of the Ponzi scheme. They would file for bankruptcy in March of 1993 under Chapter 11 of the United States Bankruptcy Code. Of course, since this whole thing is violently, wildly illegal, criminal charges had to be filed. Hoffenberg himself would plead guilty in April 1995 to 5 criminal charges. He had cheated thousands of investors out of a total of $462 million. He surrendered to the FBI in Manhattan and was arraigned and then released on bail. He'd be officially sentenced in 1997 to 20 years in prison, though he only served 18, being released in 2013. He also was sentenced to pay restitution of $462 million, which is the exact same amount he cheated out of investors, so that's fair, as well as a $1 million fine. 2 other members of the company were also charged. Mitchell Brader and Michael Rossif were handed prison sentences of 7 to 9 years. Rossoff, who was the chief legal officer and a lawyer, was also disbarred for his involvement. But Epstein wasn't charged. There was no evidence that he had done anything, which is really funny, because according to Hoffenberg, no, Epstein was actually totally involved in this whole thing. In fact, he was the orchestrator of it. But Hoffenberg never explained all this until July of 2019. And when asked why he didn't just say that at the time, Hoffenberg explained that he didn't do that because Epstein had ties to the United States Department of Justice. Because apparently Epstein had a bit of a controlling effect. He was really good at manipulating people. But according to Hoffenberg, Epstein had the dominant role in the whole scheme, and that he was the one with the detailed plan to turn Towers Financial into a financial powerhouse of funding money products around the world, but to do it illegally. But naturally, Epstein was never tried for anything involving Towers Financial. After all, as you know, he, died in a Manhattan prison. Supposedly killed himself. Some will argue about this in the comments, I'm sure, but that's the official story that I have to roll with. He apparently killed himself while on detention in a Manhattan prison. Regardless, the man is dead, and you can't try a dead man. As for Steve Hoffenberg, well, he also died. Late August 2022. He was actually friends with one of Epstein's accusers, Maria Farmer, and she wound up calling the police to check on Hoffenberg because she couldn't get a hold of him over the phone during the preceding week and was worried. They found him dead and estimated that he'd been that way for roughly a week. He was 77 years old. In case you're thinking anything conspiratory-wise, given he was obviously against Epstein, well, the coroner report showed that he had actually died of natural causes. It's probably worth mentioning that he had actually tested positive for COVID-19 not long before his death. That, coupled with his age, well, you could probably see what happened here. Regardless, Towers Financial Corporation is a bit of a wild ride, but also maybe just don't commit a Ponzi scheme. Also, never listen to this guy, ever. Seriously. And with that, special thank you to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Road Videos, Lord Off 444, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Redlion, Ennis Products 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Andrew Bowen, Josh Johnson, Caleb Braidwaters, Prez Trenton, Master of None, Travis Dolinsky, Jared Brussel, JBL Explorers, Tommy Rossini, Ben Nicola, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mark Holding, G Wiz, Mr. Terrevel, Hayden DeGrow, Metal for Life Guy, No, Kurt Forkham, Ohio Trucker 1, Mitchell Cole, Mr. Sleepy, Dr. Racer 78, Williard Conklin, Windy City Rails, DM Travel Typhoon, Harry, Drew Debris, George Kenny, Kevin Wood, Liam Wright, Morris Hillman Productions, NJ 1969, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Hannah Bird, Western Colorado History, AET Museum, Ryan Wehofer, Der Roushi, Murder Drone Stall, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fun farewell.